A year before he died, my grandfather told me a story. He was, in the way that old soldiers often are, a no-nonsense, upright man of few words. It was the morning following my 20th birthday, and he telephoned me at 9:30 on the dot, requesting my presence at his home on the outskirts of Salcombe, approximately half an hour's drive. I arrived nursing a hangover from the previous night, and he offered me a cigarette. When I hesitated, he just laughed and told me that he knew I smoked, and that he wouldn't tell my father. We sat together on his porch and smoked in silence, watching the waves crash against the Devonshire coast. Eventually, he stubbed out the butt of the silk cut and produced a shoebox, which he handed to me. "I want to tell you about the war," he said, his speech slow and slurred from a minor stroke he had suffered 2 years prior. Knowing how he felt on the matter, he had not even congratulated me on my successful application to join the army several weeks prior. I said, "Grandpa, you don't have to." "I need to," he said. "Open the box." I obliged. Inside was a beret wrapped around 3 items: a key, a tubular bundle of tissue paper, and something heavy in oilcloth. I put the box down and picked up the key, admiring the intricate brasswork and unusually complex blade. "The only other person that knew this story was your grandma, and she's gone now. I won't be around forever either, you know. It's important people know." We were silent for a couple minutes. It sounds selfish, but I hate when old people talk so fatalistically. That said, my curiosity was piqued by the grim show-and-tell atmosphere. He lit another cigarette, letting the flame of his match linger just long enough that the wood about its head had begun to curl and blacken. Then he shook it out. "I joined the war too late," he said. "All through school, my friend Nick and I just wanted to be heroes. When the time finally came, and we were gearing up to fight the Nazis in France, our damn unit was diverted." "Where were you sent?" I asked. He took a deep drag on the smoke. "Channel Islands, the only part of the British Isles to be occupied by the Germans. Coinciding with the liberation of France, we were preparing to attack the Isle of Jersey when the Jerrys surrendered. Just a few hundred of them, holed up in their rat warrens in the cliffs." He paused and tapped the cigarette with a forefinger so that glowing ashes tumbled from it and were snuffed out by the wind like miniature dying stars. "The night after the surrender, Nick and I were sitting in the pub, being bought drinks by the locals, when a woman burst in from the rain, crying and shouting for help. Naturally, we asked her what was wrong, and she told us that her children had been taken hostage. A bastard by the name of Patar Saher. He was some kind of priest that the Nazis had brought with them when they landed, or so she said. Nick asked where he'd taken the kids, and she said that he'd stolen a rowboat and was on his way to a little offshoot island called Babel Rock. She was sure that he was going to kill him. Nick and I ran to our superiors, but as soon as we mentioned Babel Rock, they wanted to call for help from the Americans and wait until light. They took our rifles away and told us to forget the whole thing, but I would sooner have been court-martialed than let some American GI have the glory. This was our fight, our war, and no matter how small it was, how insignificant in the grand scheme of things, we would fight it. This was our home, you know. We stole a boat of our own and set out into the storm. I wish I'd stopped to think about things for a second, but I was young and stupid. We both were. Grandpa put down the cigarette and unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside it was a large, old-fashioned looking pistol with faded wooden grips. "Jesus, Grandpa," I said. "Are you allowed to have that?" He winked. "What they don't know won't hurt them. Was true then, it's true now. I won it in cards from a Yank back in London before we set out for the islands. Nobody knew I had it, so they couldn't take it away." He set down the gun and stuck the smoke back in his mouth, exhaling blue fumes at the dying sun that was slipping beneath the horizon. Long story short, we land alone on this bleak old rock, right in the middle of a storm, black as the devil's eyes, and so sharp and craggy that it sliced one of my boots right open along the sole. There was one building on the island, a wooden shack overlooking the beach. It was dark, not just because of the time of day. You couldn't see more than 5 feet in front of you. I remember looking up at the sky and seeing the clouds all lit up by lightning flashes from the inside, like big stone lanterns. The clouds were coiling around above Babel Rock, and there was a hole in the very center, above the house. Not just a hole in the clouds, but in the sky itself. There were no stars, just like a black, empty space, sucking in the storm clouds. As we were heading up the beach, with nothing but the lightning to show us the way, I swear to God, it looked like the rain was falling up into that hole in the sky. Grandpa paused and sucked on his cigarette. The tip glowed brightly and illuminated his face with a faint orange hue. Then he continued. I booted open the door of the house, waving the gun around like some madman. But it was deserted. We poked around and eventually came across a trap door under a carpet. Beneath the shack were stone steps, coiling downwards into a handful of rooms carved into the rock itself. Not rooms for people, though. The dimensions were all wrong. The corridors were really tall, about 9 feet high, but so narrow we had to turn sideways to get through them. Everything was covered in weird scratchings, too, in the walls and on the ceiling. Roman numerals, I think. Everything was quiet, except for the storm outside, and we were just starting to regret ever going there, heroism or no, when we rounded a corner and found the children. He kneaded his brow. That's a bloody sight I won't ever forget. They were stood in a ring in this big, oval-shaped room. Their eyes were all rolled back, so you couldn't see the pupils, and they were each reading from a little book, like a Bible. But I couldn't understand a word of what they were saying. It wasn't German or Latin or any language I know. Before I could say anything or do anything, I heard a voice behind me. Horrible, deep, resounding. It said, "Halt." And I turned around, and there's Petar, this fat Jerry bastard in priest robes, and he's got a little pistol to Nick's head. Told me to drop my gun and kick it over to him. And I mean, of course I did. This was Nick. He lived 2 doors down from me my entire life. He was my best friend. Being a hero is nothing when it costs you everything. Grandpa paused, and I saw his leathery cheeks glistening, wet from tears. Then he blew Nick's brains out. Just like that. Shot him in the side of the head. I lunged for him, trying to grab the gun, and he shot me too. Shattered my kneecap. That's why I need this. He tapped the heavy stick that he'd hobbled around on as long as I knew him. Then he flicked away the end of his cigarette and reopened the pack with trembling fingers. It was empty. I handed him my half-smoked one, and he nodded his thanks. I passed out, he said, his face now lost to the rush of night. When I came to, his face was inches away from mine, and I could feel his breath on my cheek. He stank of rotting meat. There was something wrong with his eyes, too. Black. Black as that hole in the sky. He spoke to me then. He asked me in broken English if I believed in God. I could barely speak. The pain was too much, but I nodded, and he asked me if I would like to meet him. I thought then that he was just threatening to kill me, to send me to meet my maker. So I shook my head, and I think that surprised him. He stood up, walked away from me to the opposite wall, and that's when I saw the door for the first time. It was massive, almost touching the ceiling, about 4 feet wide, and it was made of some kind of black rock. It had carved on it an apple tree, and there was a snake coiling down the trunk. The snake had its head turned side onto you, and instead of an eye, there was a weird, jagged keyhole. He went to the kids, chanting throughout all this, and picked up a key. This key, off the pedestal they were gathered around. Grandpa gestured at the key, its brass swastika head glinting beneath the glow of his cigarette. Patar said that he'd spent 11 years of his life secretly visiting Babel Rock, measuring the keyhole and designing a key to fit. I asked him whether he put the door there, and he gave me an odd look and told me it had been there before men even walked the earth. Then he unlocked the door and stepped backwards, speaking words in German I couldn't understand. And then something started to push the door open from the other side. As it opened, just a crack, all the candles in the room went out, and we were in darkness. The only light was coming from a lantern in the next room, and it was just me, Patar, and whatever was opening that door. And all the while, the kids were chanting and singing. It opened a few inches more, and a hand came through, all charred and calloused. But it wasn't a human hand. It was small, with long, hooked fingertips, and it coiled around the edge of the door, as though it were cautious of entering the room. As it did, the air began to taste of seawater and sulfur, and I was more scared then than I've been in my entire life. I tore my eyes away, dragged myself over to my .45, and turned around and shot Patar in the back. Pow! He mimed a pistol with his hand. His blood splashed across the door and wall, but it also landed on that hand. As soon as it came into contact with that blood, it went crazy. The hand tightened its grip on the door and started pushing. This was solid stone, about a foot thick, and this thing was just shoving it open. I forgot my pain then. Fear was giving me strength, and I limped across the room and slammed my shoulder against the door. I must have surprised it, because I felt it give way and I heaved with every ounce of strength in my body. God, I was tough as a lad. He sucked on the smoke, the tip flaring up against the night. I almost had it. The door was almost closed. But that hand, that blasted monster of a hand, still there, reaching round at me. I pulled out my boot knife, and I hacked one of its fingers off. It howled, or maybe that was just the storm above us, but the hand retreated, and I slammed the door closed. Then, to my horror, the door shuddered and opened a crack. It was throwing its weight against it, desperate to get into our world. I pushed back, and then I noticed the key sticking out beside my hand. I forced the door closed one last time. Then I turned that key and threw it away from me across the room. The second the key left the door, the banging stopped. Everything was silent. The kids all kinda jolted awake, like sleepwalkers, and started crying. All of us were covered in Nick's blood and petars. That finger I hacked off flared up, caught fire, and in seconds, it was nothing but bone. I went to Nick, but he was long gone, so I picked up the gun and went to Petar instead. He looked up at me and he said something in German, words that echo round in my head every night. I shot him again and again, until there were no bullets left in my gun, and he was unrecognizable. And then the pain hit me again. I blacked out. Grandpa took a final drag on his cigarette, then he ground it into the ashtray. We sat, unmoving and unspeaking in his garden, our silhouettes picked out white-edged by the stars, like marble statues seated in eternal vigil for the men that had sailed across the sea and never returned. I gazed at him, and in that half-light, he could almost be the fit, powerfully built young man in the photographs that had adorned the walls of his house before Grandma had passed away. I had no idea what to think or to feel, or how much of his story was true, but I was enthralled by his words. What happened then, Grandpa? As he replied, the clouds began to shift over the stars like curtains being drawn over a stage, so that his words seemed to come from some unspecified point in the darkness, and I were speaking to a ghost. When I came to, I heard shouting from far above, commands being given, boots on the stairs. English voices, I was sure. I grabbed the gun and shoved it into my jacket. I knew that if my superiors knew about it, I'd be in even deeper shit than I already was. Then I saw Nick, lying there on the ground, and I knew that I had to get something, some proof, so that other people would know that his death hadn't been in vain. I grabbed the key and put it in my pocket, but then I figured it's just a key, could be for anything. Then I saw the finger, the one I'd hacked off the hand of God or whatever the hell that thing was. It was just a charred bone by now, but it was intact, so I grabbed that too. As I stuck it into my pocket, men burst into the room, dressed like paratroopers with camo paint smeared over their faces. No symbols or insignias on their uniforms either. Next thing I know, someone's sticking a gun in my face and yelling at me to identify myself. Naturally, I did, and they talked amongst themselves for a few minutes. They dragged me out of the room and onto the island itself. The storm had blown itself out. One of them sat with me. I tried talking to him, but he just straight out blanked me. I guess they must have been special forces of some sort, on strict orders not to talk to prisoners. I think I heard gunfire from the tunnels below, but I was so far above them I couldn't be sure. As far as I could recall, the only living things down there were the Spec Op boys and those kids. So what they could have been shooting at, I have no idea. Eventually, a rescue boat shows up, and a medic sees to my leg while some big brass guy lectures me on the importance of subtlety. Before I was allowed on the boat, though, he straight up told me that if I breathed a word of what I saw on Babel Rock to anyone, my friends, the townspeople, anyone, they'd shoot me. Then, when I got back to Jersey, my commanding officer sat me down in his office and told me that I would be retired due to my injuries, and that if I kept my mouth shut, I'd get a war pension from the government, and I'd be comfortable for the rest of my life. I asked about Nick, and the man went all quiet. Then he told me that his next of kin would be looked after. I think they got the newspapers to report him dying a hero, fighting Jerry Commandos or something. I never read past the first few lines of that article. I just kept seeing him in that cave, gun to his head, and eyes pleading for me to save him. So, you never told anyone? I asked. Who would you have me tell? Nobody would believe me, would they? They'd just think I was insulting Nick's memory, trying to steal the glory from him. I loved him like a brother, too much to take his story away from him. I'm sorry, Grandpa, I didn't mean. He laid a hand on my shoulder. It's okay. He struck a match and unwrapped the tissue paper. Inside, long and angular, there lay a skeletal, humanoid finger, far too long to be from a man, and with bone hardened and pointed at the tip, like a claw. I gazed at it, in awe, in horror, before whispering, "I'm so sorry, Grandpa." He smiled and patted me on the shoulder. Then he blew out the match, and I heard him gathering the 3 items he had showed me back into their box. It was as I was unlocking my car that I heard him call to me again. He was standing in the doorway, lit from behind in an otherwise featureless darkness. Well done on getting the job. Be careful over there. In Afghanistan, I mean. Always rely on your judgment, no matter what they tell you. He closed the door. I sat in my car in the dark for nearly an hour, thinking about what he'd said. When I got home, my father was already in bed, and I lay awake, gazing at the dark ceiling. I imagined it to be the voidous center of that storm my grandfather had seen all those years ago. He left me the house in his will. I retired from the army after being shot in the hip during an ambush in Kabul, and I was looking forward to the peace that Granddad's old place on the coast would surely bring. When I was moving some of his things in the attic, I stumbled across the shoebox again. It was all there. The gun, the key, the finger. Like the realization of some strange dream, the memories of that night flooded back, and I sat down and cried for the first time since his funeral. I took a ferry to Jersey recently, and then hired a local fisherman to take me to Babel Rock. Under the sun, with nothing but the laughter of seabirds in my ears and the taste of salt water in the air, it was actually a relatively peaceful place. The eye of a storm. There was no shack, though, I suppose it was probably destroyed shortly after the events of my grandfather's story. I found a heavy iron hatch, under which was a stairwell, but that ended in a square brick room, scrawled with graffiti and full of empty crisp packets. When the sunset was at its apex, licking at the ocean with a long orange tongue, I wrapped the 3 items in his beret and hurled them off the cliff, where the hungry, frothing jaws of the sea snapped them up. Then I sat with a thermos of tea and imagined Grandpa and Nick sitting together on a boat destined for London, full of stories of heroism. Perhaps he believed the story best forgotten, that he wasn't a hero. But I believe differently. I heard the bells jingle on the door and looked up from my sweeping to say, "We were just getting ready to close up shop." I was the only one working, but my boss insisted I always use we. I suppose he thought it was safer that way. The old Boston neighborhood sometimes got a little dicey at night. The gentleman smiled politely and nodded. "I'll be quick. At least I'll try," he said, tipping his silver-topped cane. He was young, looked to be in his late 30s, well-dressed with a long black leather coat. He walked, favoring his left leg. As he perused the aisles filled with bouquets of lilies, daisies, and carnations, he made his way towards our largest display, roses, of every color imaginable. I was in no hurry. It was Valentine's Day, and my work part-time at the flower shop over the last 3 years had taught me that going above and beyond on this particular day could yield some extremely nice tips. Between the fact that my car payment was due on the 15th, and after making said payment, I would be left with exactly $172 in my bank account, I had told my boss that I would be happy to keep the flower shop open late. As a guy, I knew that Valentine's Day could kind of sneak up on you. And as I was not in a relationship at the moment, the least I could do was assist my fellow travelers in their romantic endeavors. "Are you looking for something particular?" I asked. Searching, he paused, then smiled. "I'll take 24 of these." He pointed towards a vase filled with dark red roses named Eternity. They were so dark in color that they were almost a velvety black. And I would like one single white rose at the center. "Very nice choice. Would you like them in a gift box or a vase?" I asked. Walking up to the counter, he paused. As he looked directly at me, I could see a hint of sadness in his eyes. "The thing is, I have a rather unusual request. I need them delivered tonight, and to my exact specifications." I looked up at the clock on the wall. It was just past 10. When I looked back at him, he was pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "There's $2,000 cash inside. You can keep it for yourself. Off the books, so to speak." I glanced at the packet as he set it on the counter, hesitated, then asked, "What exactly would I be delivering?" He chuckled and shook his head. Just the flowers, that's all. It's the location that you may have a problem with. Allow me to explain. Many years ago, I met my one true love. I won't go into detail, but for me, there will be no other. It became our tradition, if you will, on every Valentine's Day, at exactly midnight, I would present her with a single white rose, surrounded by dark red roses. Pausing, his voice turned grim as he continued. A few years ago, she was taken from me. I wasn't there. I would have stopped it. He paused to gather himself, then went on. Since then, every year at exactly midnight, I place the flowers on her grave. She is buried at the Forest Hills Cemetery. It's not far from here. The main gates are locked by 11, but there is a small iron gate that is left open. I always do it myself, but this year, he lifted the cane. So, will you make the delivery? I was silent for a long moment. I thought about my car payment, and I thought about how long it would take me to earn $2,000. Okay, I said. I'll do it. He nodded and handed me another envelope. These are the instructions. Follow them explicitly. Turning away, he moved slowly towards the door. The bells jangled again. I watched through the window as he walked across the darkened street and disappeared around a corner. I busied myself closing up the shop, all the while thinking about my bizarre assignment. I considered letting my boss know, but I wanted to keep the cash for myself. So I put on my jacket, pocketed both envelopes, picked out the 24 red roses plus 1 white, and headed for my car. It was cold, so as I waited for my car to warm up, I opened the set of instructions. Nothing too strange, just directions to the cemetery and the location of her grave with a little hand-drawn map. I was to place the roses exactly at midnight and light a candle. Entering Forest Hills Cemetery into my phone, I pulled out of the parking lot. 20 minutes later, I was parked along the street adjacent to the cemetery. It was 11:30. I found the small gate unlocked and walked through. It opened onto a path that meandered and branched out to several other paths. I referred to the hand-drawn map included with the instructions to keep from getting lost. The place was vast and surrounded by woods. There was a light breeze that kept the clouds moving slowly across a near full moon. As I walked, I thought, ironically, what a perfect night for a walk through an eerie cemetery. After about 15 minutes, I arrived at the final turnoff. The marker said Cove's Rest, and it looked to be in the oldest section. The stones were large and worn. Some had statues of angels and huge marble crosses. The path dead-ended at her grave, which turned out not to be a grave, but a small mausoleum. A little stone house with 4 pillars, and a door with a small window. A few feet in front of the door was a bench facing a stone circle, with a large gray marble vase at the center. Setting the flowers down on the bench, I checked my phone. 11:55. The second I laid my eyes on the little stone house, which, by the way, looked absolutely ancient, I began to feel on edge. I started to think about the nameless gentleman who paid in cash, and the thought occurred to me that he was the only person on Earth who knew where I was. 11:58. 2 minutes to go. I could wait 2 minutes. Looking back at the mausoleum, I noticed a small ledge just under the window. It held a candle, presumably the one I was supposed to light, and what looked to be a box of matches. 1 minute left. I gathered the flowers, put the white rose hastily in the center, and stood at the ready, because when my phone clicked over to midnight, I was getting the hell out of there. The wind picked up. Even so, I thought that I heard something scurry inside the little stone house. Probably just rats. The final second ticked by. It was midnight. I practically threw the roses into the urn, then half ran the few steps to the door of the mausoleum. With shaking hands, I opened the matchbook. The first one didn't light. Swearing now, I tried another. It burst into flame. Protecting it from the wind, I lit the candle. The sudden light from the match had temporarily blinded me, so I didn't see the woman's hand reach out from the window. I felt it close like a vice around my wrist. I screamed and tried to pull away, but she held on. Her grip was like steel, and it was as cold as ice. The grip tightened until I felt the bones in my wrist stressed to the breaking point, and I was pulled forward. I was being slowly forced into the crypt. First my fingers, then my wrist, disappeared through the window into darkness. And in that black darkness, I thought I saw two cold blue eyes looking back at me. Wildly desperate now, I reached for my pocket knife, snapped it open, and stabbed at her hand. I must have hit something because she loosened her grip. Pulling back with all my strength, I heard a snapping sound. Then I landed hard on the cold ground. I was up and running in a millisecond, and I never stopped, even when I lost the path. I just kept running till I found a section of fence. Then I practically threw myself up and over the top. It took me quite a while to find my car, but I finally made it home. Some time has passed now, and I try not to think too much about it. Not if I want to sleep at night. But on some cold winter nights, I wonder. I wonder about the other people he sent as a gift on Valentine's days past. And I wonder about the inscription above the door of the little stone house. Love. Eternal. Having difficulty staying awake there. Trying to study for some big exam, finish some last-minute assignment that you put off all weekend, and it's now 3 in the morning and you are absolutely exhausted. Or perhaps you were in a similar state recently and are looking for help on what to do. Well, friend, I have just the prescription to ease your weary mind. All you need to do is win a game. Setting up the game is relatively simple. All you need is an hourglass, a candle, and a marker. Let me make one thing specifically clear. You need an hourglass, Not one of those rinky-dink 30-second pieces of crap you get out of a cereal box or board game. Before playing the game, test your hourglass to make sure that it takes an hour or slightly longer to drain all of the sand from one section to the other. Having it take slightly longer will help, but too long or too short and you'll run into complications during the game. You must also be completely alone in the room while playing. When you are ready to play, choose any room that can be sealed, simply meaning that all doorways and windows can be closed. Any other form of timekeeping device or alarm must be taken out of the room prior, or the game will not begin. The hourglass will be your only time tracking tool, hence why having an accurate hourglass is important. Anything with an electronic display should also be removed. This includes TVs, cell phones, computer monitors, anything. Leaving them in the room during the game will put you at a massive disadvantage. You may begin the game at 8 p.m. Make sure the room is sealed, drawing the curtains to block any outside light. Then draw a simplistic hourglass shape on the back of one of your hands. Make sure to remember well which hand it was, since you'll mostly be in the dark for this game. Take the candle and light it. Then turn off the lights, and sit down on the floor with the 3 previously mentioned objects close together, and flip the hourglass so the sand begins to fall into an empty half. The only source of light should be your candle. Now, yell something along the lines of, "I'm not tired and I refuse to go to sleep." Close your eyes to the count of 10, and open them again. You won't be entirely sure, but somewhere in the room you'll think you can see the shadowy outline of a man. You have now begun the game, and your opponent is none other than the Master of Sleep himself, the Sandman. Do not provoke him, and don't speak to him either. You've challenged him, and in a way insulted him about his profession, so he's not in the best of moods to say the least. Now comes the game. Your task is to stay awake as long as possible, to a maximum of 8 hours, which will take you to 4 a.m. Every hour, you must flip the hourglass to reset it and keep the game going. Each time you flip the hourglass, you may take the marker and draw a tally mark on your arm. The specifics of which arm you mark will be explained later. And don't think you can just flip the hourglass 8 times really quickly, or just draw 8 lines on your arm. The hour needs to pass in order for the magic to work. If you fail to flip the hourglass before the very last grain of sand falls, or should you succumb to sleep, you will lose. During this time, the Sandman will be deploying as many tricks as possible to get you to fall asleep or give in. See, the bottom half of your hourglass, at any time, represents his power. The more sand in it, the stronger his influence will be. Almost immediately upon starting, you'll begin to feel drowsy. This is merely his presence. If you can't last against this, stop playing immediately. During the first hour, he won't do a lot. He may walk around the room, but he won't touch you or speak to you, even if you try to talk to the being, which is something you should really avoid doing. There will be no response. Also, don't move from your spot to approach him. The closer you get, the more drowsy you will become, and if you're not near your candle, he may put it out so you can go to sleep. Do not distract yourself during this. You may easily lose track of time and forget to flip the hourglass as needed. The Sandman can also skew your perception of how much time has passed, but he cannot affect the hourglass. So keeping your focus on that is your best chance of winning. Side note, if you try to leave the room, you will find that the doors are all locked, and the windows reveal nothing but an unyielding darkness as far as the eye can see. After you pass the first hour, the Sandman may scoff, but will continue to stay in the room. Now he will begin to pull more from his bag of tricks. He's seen that you're going to be a hard one to put down. The sounds of music boxes and harps may be heard, at first from a distance, but will slowly grow to a level that would be audible and comforting. Resist the urge to close your eyes and listen. Your body will grow wary as you approach hour 2 or 3, depending on how the Sandman is feeling that night. Around this point, he will begin speaking to you in many voices. The soft voice of a young girl, the wise cackling laugh of a grandparent, or perhaps even the ever-loving, recognizable words of your own mother. They will try to congratulate you on surviving for so long with the Sandman, for braving sleepless days and nights to win this game. Whispers of lullabies and nursery rhymes will fill your head. But you know better. Say nothing, and ignore the voices. No matter how real they may seem, don't listen to them. Do not go to sleep. If you manage to make it to the halfway point and now have 4 marks on your arm, you'll be nothing less than exhausted, and the Sandman will be nothing less than enraged. He will begin to manipulate your environment even more and start using new tactics to get you to sleep. Instead of trying to lull you to sleep, he will attack you. Hallucinations will occur. You'll see horrifying images of the dead hanging from the ceiling, flashed by a spotlight of unknown origin. The room may start to close in, and then stretch out, and close in again, and stretch back out. A whisper in your ear will turn into shouting in your face from an invisible source. Already weakened and sleep-deprived, your remaining energy will be drained in bursts from his terrors. You may have sudden adrenaline rushes, sure, but the Sandman is clever. He'll time them so that you can't just survive the next hour by simply being anxious. He'll wait until your emotional state has fallen just another level lower. And then bam, 2 rotted feet dangling in front of your face. You can scream all you want. You can beg for him to stop. But this will only use up more of your ability to function. At the 6-hour mark, the hallucinations will shift between horror and comfort. While the Sandman will begin to pick your brain and find what nightmares caused you to come to a cold sweat many a night, others will coax you towards slumber, claiming that you've put up with enough and that you deserve your rest. A warm bed to tuck yourself into. A pillow made from the softest of furs and feathers. The harps and music boxes will start to overload your sense of hearing. In your state, you may welcome the chance to sleep, but snap out of it. Have you been watching the hourglass? Make sure his terrors aren't distracting you. This is why you don't talk to the Sandman. For every tiny detail about yourself you give him, he will use against you here. This is also the point where electronic displays can become a massive problem. They will turn on, regardless of whether they are powered or not, and should you gaze upon their mystifying image for too long, your eyelids will droop, and your body will collapse onto the floor. If you had just turned the screens away, the Sandman might use some muscle and turn it back towards you, so you can get a better view. The curtains may open to a brilliant dawn or a clear blue sky, but the only truths in this room are your arm and the hourglass. Unless you have 8 marks, this game is not over. Use any ounce of strength you have to flip that hourglass, now an immense chore from the Sandman's influence. Scrawl a line down your arm with a marker, even if it looks like you're taking a knife and slashing your own arm open. During the final hour, the Sandman will begin to address you directly, asking you questions that appear to be simple, but as you are, you can't even remember what 2 + 2 equals. A question is the hardest thing to get out of your head, so don't let it get in. Cover your ears and just watch the hourglass. Keep those eyes open. Don't fall asleep. If the question gets in your head, you'll start to think about it, adding more stress and draining you of what little mental will you have left. It might become hard to breathe, as if something is squeezing your lungs, or the air is dense and hard to take. The Sandman will also get physical, grabbing you and throwing you across the room, leaving you to crawl back to the hourglass before time is up. If you catch a glimpse of his face, it may be enough of a nightmare to haunt you and keep your eyes from shutting. There will be no distinguishable facial features, save 2 bloody eyes, the lids torn from the sockets, endlessly staring. If you can't take it anymore at any point before the 8th hour is completed, take the hourglass and break it with all your might. Both sections must be broken for the game to end. For your sake, I hope it was made of glass. Anyone who has made it to the 7th hour mark has never had the strength to successfully break it, and either carried on or surrendered to their dreams. You will not receive a reward for ending the game this way, save the mercy of avoiding the Sandman's wrath. If you do make it to the end of the 8th hour without falling asleep, you will not need to flip the hourglass again. Simply make the 8th mark on your arm and close your eyes. Though you ended the game, you cannot sleep just yet. There's one final task remaining. All you must do is wait for the Sandman to collect the hourglass and say,
"You're all grown up now. Sleep when you wish."
Open your eyes and find that the hourglass is gone and the candle put out. Now you may collapse in slumber, a 12-hour slumber to be precise. The game puts a heavy strain on your mind and body, so recovery is necessary. But it's the last time you'll ever need, or at least to that length, because once you've fully recovered, you'll be able to stay awake for an extra hour for each tally on your marked arm. Depending on your normal sleep schedule, this may mean you only need a small nap, maybe an hour or 2 at most. But for some, you'll never have to lie down again. Sure, you will have the ability to do so if you want to. You can still even dream, but there will never be any weariness following you. Just think of how productive you can be. But it's not all sugar plums and gumdrops. If you mark any tallies on the arm that were not marked by the hourglass, you will instead require more sleep. 1 hour for each tally on the blank arm to be precise. You will require more rest to be able to even function throughout your day. Now, these marks can cancel with the ones on your marked arm, but if that's not the case, you may have just gone through all of that suffering, only to come out worse than before. And what with your delirious state throughout the game, it's unlikely for the average individual to come out with all their tallies on the marked arm. There are also the circumstances of losing. If you fail to flip the hourglass, then the Sandman will gain full power, and with a snap of his fingers you will collapse to the ground. Regardless of how you fall asleep, be it by failure of the hourglass or succumbing to your own tiredness, you will also sleep for 12 hours to recover, but it will be the worst sleep you will ever have. and the Sandman will make damn sure that that's the case. The worst nightmares will flood your mind, leaving you unable to escape or wake up in a relief-filled cold sweat. All you can do is endure the torture of a dream that feels like years in length. And when you finally come to consciousness the next morning, there you will be, lying on the floor of the room, the mark still on your arm, and blood flowing from where your eyelids once rested. You said you refused to close your eyes and go to sleep. The Sandman has simply granted that wish.